Welcome back, young scholars. This is the first of a series of videos on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video. First, in what ways were the societies of the Americas similar to Afro-Eurasia? In what ways were they different? Second, how were the Maya organized politically? And third, were the Maya bloodthirsty barbarians or sophisticated stargazers? So the story of the people of the Americas really begins during the Paleolithic era, about 25,000 years ago. It was during an ice age where, because of glaciers that covered the northern hemisphere, we had a land bridge that had formed between Asia and North America, and that allowed some nomadic people who were living in Asia at the time to cross over, most likely by way of a land bridge. It's possible they also came over on boats to North America. Around 20,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended, causing those people to then be cut off. They started spreading out over the course of about 1,000 years. They very quickly began to inhabit all of North America and South America. Like the people of Afro-Eurasia, the people of the Americas began domesticating local plants and animals around 5000 BCE. We talked about the agricultural revolution occurring independently in various parts of the world, and one of the places that was a cradle of farming was in Mesoamerica and in the Andes Mountains of South America. How incredible were the indigenous farmers of the Americas? So this is teosinte. Do you know what teosinte is? It's a wild grass which over time, the indigenous peoples of the America were able to domesticate and turn into our modern day corn. Most of the indigenous peoples of the Americas were engaged in subsistence farming, and they oftentimes farmed crops like corn, which is known as maize, and that occurred in Mesoamerica, in Central America, and also the potato in South America in the Andes Mountains region. Subsistence farming means that they were essentially growing food for themselves, their family, maybe their tribe, but not on any kind of massive scale like plantation agriculture, where crops are produced in abundance in order to be sold for profit. So we see here the two cradles of farming, Mesoamerica, where they domesticated corn, tomato, cotton, and turkey, in the Andes Mountains region, where they domesticated potatoes and the llama. Compared to Afro-Eurasia, societies of the Americas were far more geographically isolated. Now, this does not mean that the indigenous peoples of the America weren't engaged in trade and networks of exchange. So while networks of exchange did develop, especially in regions like around the Mississippi River Valley, or here on the west coast, we see these intra-regional networks forming. So those are networks of exchange that occur within the region of North America. Something similar we see when it comes to Latin America. We see intra-regional exchanges, but we don't see exchanges between North America and Latin America. The two major centers of civilization, which were in the Mesoamerican region and the Andes Mountains region, had very little contact. The only significant evidence we have of any contact is that we see corn spreading first from this Mesoamerican region down into South America. Why are interactions and networks of exchange less prevalent in the Americas? Well, there's a few different reasons. One, the Americas had far fewer domesticable animals to choose from. The only large domesticable pack animal that was native to the Americas was the llama, and that was actually only in the region of the Andes Mountains in South America. The impact of this, when you don't have large domesticated animals, you don't really have a reason to produce transportation technologies like wheeled vehicles. Now, that does not mean that people of the Americas didn't understand the technology of the wheel. They produced toys that had wheels on them, but they didn't have a reason to build larger carts like in Afro-Eurasia. Another possible explanation has to do with the axis of the orientation of the continents. So you'll see here that the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa, the axis of orientation goes from north to south. In Eurasia, it predominantly goes from east to west. And the impact of this is that crops tend to spread more readily across continents that are oriented from the east-west direction. The reason for this is that crops grow at essentially the same latitude. Now, the impact of this is once you slow down the spread of domesticated crops, that also leads to a slowdown in the spreading of culture, such as writing or the technology of metals. And it's not like the indigenous peoples of the Americas didn't know how to produce these technological innovations. So, for example, the Maya had developed a form of writing, but it never really spreads much beyond that region of Mesoamerica. In spite of these environmental limitations, the people of the Americas developed advanced city-states like Cahokia, which is one we'll study in the Mississippi culture, advanced civilizations like the Maya civilization. And ultimately, by the time we get to 1200 to 1450, we even see the development and establishment of various empires like the Mexica, also known as the Aztecs, and the Incan Empire down here in South America along the Andes Mountains. Geographic variety in North America is going to cause natives to coalesce into many distinct linguistic and cultural groups. We saw something similar in Africa, where we saw the great diversity of geography of sub-Saharan Africa. And we see something similar in North America with a variety of different ecological zones, leads to the formation of lots of different distinct cultural and linguistic groups across North America. Some examples, one is the Mississippian culture, which forms in the region of the Mississippi River Valley. The Pueblo culture here in the southwest of the United States. And there's also a number of other ones that we just won't go deeper into, including the indigenous peoples of the Northwest Coast in California, indigenous people of the Great Plains. So first I want to discuss the Mississippian culture. There's a very interesting site located outside of the city of St. Louis, where there's what looks like a naturally occurring hill, but it's in fact a man-made mound. It was built by indigenous people living in a city known as Cahokia. There's a lot of misconceptions about the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The erroneous thinking goes that the indigenous people of the Americas didn't live in urban areas, when in fact they actually did build these massive urban centers. Moreover, they built these cities without the advantage of having any large domesticated pack animals to do, for instance, any of the moving of dirt. And so they ended up building these mounds entirely with their own muscle power. So here we see the city of Cahokia and this whole Mississippian culture. Now the Mississippians built these monumental earthwork architectures. They engaged in mound building in cities like Cahokia, which served as trade and ceremonial centers. So here we can see like a marketplace, and then these large earthen mounds which served as ceremonial centers for their cultural and religious practices. A second site constructed by the Mississippian people is this one. It's called Serpent Mound. It's located in Ohio. You can draw a conclusion that the indigenous peoples of this region were worshiping some type of snake-like god, and so they established this massive earthwork to essentially create this place where people would come together and worship this god. The Puebloans were another indigenous people. They built these cliff dwellings at the city of Mesa Verde. Why would they choose this particular location? It's obviously well defended and fortified. The Puebloans built these cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. They also built these multi-story great houses. This is one known as Chaco Canyon. This is what it was believed to have looked like at the time of the height of these Puebloan peoples. Around 1200, the Puebloans experienced some population displacement and migration, possibly as a result of drought and overexploitation of resources. Remember, around 1200 is when we see some dramatic temperature changing with the end of the medieval warming period, the beginning of the Little Ice Age. So that may have led to the ultimate collapse of their society. Now I want to shift gears and start talking about some indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. In the period prior to 1200, the major civilization that flourished in the Mesoamerican region were the Maya. How were the Maya organized politically? So we first need to understand the geography of the Maya civilization. So the Maya civilization formed on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mesoamerica, or Central America, around 300 CE. In terms of the modern day countries that includes, that would be countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Belize. And so if you're interested in visiting some Maya ruins, you might go to a Maya city, Chichen Itza, outside the modern day city of Cancun, Mexico, or down here in Guatemala, the city of Tikal. So Maya ruins can be found in modern Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. The Maya civilization was divided into many individual city-states. As we just saw on that map, you have cities like Chichen Itza and Tikal. They also built these cities without the benefit of any large domesticated pack animals. Despite having separate cities, the Maya all shared a common language and a common culture. Each city-state had its own unique ruler, its own social system. These cities in this decentralized environment were oftentimes at war with one another, and this societal structure, this political organization, should seem familiar to you. We've talked about the formation of various city-states where there is still a common language or common culture that is shared amongst the people of that particular region. The ancient Greeks, the classical Greeks, come to mind as a good example of this. Why did the Maya civilization suddenly collapse? So around 900 CE, we see a pretty significant decline or drop-off in terms of the population density of various Mayan cities. And it's most likely that that's connected to environmental factors. It is believed that there was a significant drought around 900 CE that was made worse by deforestation. So we're talking about here in this medieval warming period where we've seen temperatures increasing. It may have caused a dramatic change in rainfall levels, leading to a drought. Between 900 and 1500 CE, so this is what's really important in terms of this class that starts in 1200, the remaining Maya people continued their culture, they continued their language, they continued their religion, but they experienced significant political disorder and dislocation. At the time of 1500 comes along with the arrival of the Spanish. Many of the cities that they had constructed had been decimated in terms of their population. So were the Maya bloodthirsty barbarians or sophisticated stargazers? The Maya were polytheist. They worshipped multiple gods. You can see in this image, this ceremonial practice, most likely with some kind of religious figure, some kind of priest. You can see here a sacrifice being made. You see this figure right here, their fingers bleeding. Most likely their fingernails were plucked out. You can see some blood being offered as a sacrifice to the gods. In this image, you can see this is a Mayan queen who is pulling a rope through her tongue, and you can see some barbs or sharp thorns placed along that rope. As you can see her pulling that through her tongue, clearly that would lead to a significant amount of blood being shed. The Maya practiced bloodletting and ritual human sacrifice as a way of pleasing their gods. They believed that the gods needed a certain amount of blood in order to regenerate the earth. This was a way of continuing in the life cycle. The Maya were incredible developers of technology and intellectual achievement and innovation. I like to remember these using the acronym Maya. So the M stands for math. The first A for architecture. The Y is a bit of a stretch, but you can remember that it's connected to the calendar system or the year. And then finally, astronomy. Let's start with the system of mathematics. The Maya created a complex system of mathematics. Just to give you a sense of a little bit of Maya math, this symbol represents the number 1. This represents 2, 3, 4. When you add the line, that's the number 5. A line with 1 dot is 6. That is 9, 10, 12, 18, and finally, this is the number 20. You have a dot on top, and then on bottom, you have this symbol. Now, this symbol represents the number 0. So the Maya used the concept of 0, and instead of having a base 10 system, they utilized a base 20 system. So the Maya mathematics was based on a base 20 number system rather than our base 10 system like we use today. The Maya understood and used the concept of 0. 0 was only independently developed in 2 places, and that was in the Mesoamerica with the Maya and also in India. This number here with the 20 on top followed by the 1 in the ones place. So this is essentially their tens place, and this is our ones place. So that's 21. This number is 22. 29. This is 2 20s followed by 1, so that's 41. This is essentially our hundreds place. Their hundreds place is 20 20s, so that's 421. 421. The Maya also built these massive stone step pyramids. They were great architects. They built these without the advantage of having any large domesticated animals. You could see all of the work it would take to move this tremendous amount of stone into place. They were religious centers and palaces for the ruler. We see very similar architecture in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. The Maya constructed their pyramids with nature in mind. This is a video from the summer solstice where you can see the construction along the side of the mountain. If we take a time-lapse video, it forms the image of a snake. So you see the snake's head down here. Much like we saw at Serpent Mound in North America, they most likely worship some serpent god, and they are using the environment to essentially construct or create that god. If you stand a few hundred yards away from the Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza and you clap your hands, it makes a very distinctive sound, and it has to do with the acoustics and the way in which the temple was constructed. You can hear that sort of unique echo, and some people believe that it sounds very similar to a quetzal bird, which is found in that particular location. You can hear the quetzal followed by the clapping sound. Now, whether this was a coincidence or whether this was something that they intentionally did, that they were, again, building these temples based on their knowledge of the environment, the Maya also created a very complex calendar. They kept track of dates over a short period of time using a 13-digit system, over a bit of a longer period of time using a 20-day cycle, and then over a 365-day solar calendar year. So this is a very complex calendar system, much more complex than our 7-day week, approximately 30-day month, and 365-day year. These cycles repeated themselves just once every 52 years, which was approximately the lifespan of an individual at the time. The Maya also kept track of dates over a longer period of time using what's called the long count calendar. It is this calendar that some people believe the Maya had predicted the end of the world once it reached a particular date. This was the date December 21st, 2012, where some people had predicted that the world would end. The Maya also made important contributions in astronomy. They built planetariums like this one, where they kept track of the movement of the stars and planets. They accurately predicted the movement of the stars and planets. I mean, the planets are a lot harder than the stars because they move in all kinds of interesting patterns across the nighttime sky. They correctly calculated the solar year at 365.24 days, and that way they're very similar in terms of the advancements they made in astronomy to the Indians. They were able to accurately predict the coming of solar and lunar eclipses. Brilliant in the way in which they approach science and understanding the natural world. They also developed a complex written language. So they created a language using these images. It's more pictographic in nature. We call these glyphs. And so you can see this image here represents the word jaguar. It's a balam. But they also developed a more phonetic system that was connected to this more pictographic system. So you see here, this symbol represents the sound ba, and this represents the sound lam. So you can see here they're creating not just a pictographic system of writing, but also a phonetic system of writing. Much of this Maya writing was ultimately and sadly destroyed by the Spanish when they arrived. So we have the destruction of many of the written records of the Maya people. And so we can't, I think, fully appreciate the nature of some of their achievements and some technology and the thinking that they were doing. The big question you should be able to answer after watching this video: in what ways were the societies of the Americas similar to Afro-Eurasia? In what ways were they different? And then how are the Maya organized politically? And were the Maya bloodthirsty barbarians or sophisticated stargazers? As always, thanks for watching.